Imagine a moment when the entire weight of human freedom hangs by a single, fraying thread. The year is 1940. The Nazi war machine has crushed Poland, swept through Norway, and completely overwhelmed the defenses of France in a matter of weeks. The British Army is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, facing total annihilation. The world is watching, holding its breath, convinced that the end of Western civilization is not just possible, but imminent. In this suffocating atmosphere of dread, one man stepped forward. A man who was fiercely flawed, haunted by his own dark demons, and considered by many to be a washed-up political relic. Yet he looked into the abyss of 1,000-year darkness and simply said no. This is the story of the man who refused to let the world fall. This is the story of Winston Churchill. To understand the sheer unyielding force of Churchill during the Second World War, you have to look at the spectacular failures and adventures that forged him. He was born into the highest echelons of the British aristocracy in Blenheim Palace. Yet, he spent his entire life feeling like he had something desperate to prove. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant but erratic politician who died young and considered Winston a disappointment. Driven by the ghost of his father's disapproval, young Winston threw himself into the path of danger whenever he could find it. He was a cavalry officer in India, rode in one of the last great cavalry charges at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, and became a national hero after making a daring escape from a prisoner of war camp during the Boer War in South Africa. He was a man addicted to action, deeply convinced that destiny had marked him for something extraordinary. But that absolute self-belief also led to catastrophic disasters. During the First World War, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill championed the Gallipoli campaign. It was a bold plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, but it turned into a complete slaughter. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers became casualties. The disaster destroyed his reputation. He was forced to resign in disgrace. For most men, this would be the end of a political career. But Churchill was not like most men. To seek redemption and face his guilt, he left the safety of London and went to the trenches of the Western Front, commanding a battalion in the mud and blood of no man's land. He survived, but the stain of Gallipoli would follow him for decades. Through the 1920s and 30s, Churchill entered what he called his wilderness years. He was isolated, mocked, and dismissed as a warmonger. While the rest of the British establishment, desperate to avoid another devastating war, pursued a policy of appeasement toward a rising Adolf Hitler, Churchill saw the terrifying truth. He read Hitler's book, he watched the militarization of Germany, and he sounded the alarm. Over and over again, he stood in the House of Commons and warned that the storm was gathering. The political elite laughed at him. They called him an alarmist, a relic of the Victorian age who couldn't understand modern diplomacy. He spent these years at his country home, Chartwell, painting, laying bricks in his garden, and battling what he called his black dog, a crushing, paralyzing depression that stalked him throughout his entire life. It is one of the greatest paradoxes of history that the man who would eventually give hope to the entire world was often consumed by a profound internal darkness. Then came the spring of 1940. Hitler invaded Western Europe, and the illusion of peace shattered. The appeasers were proven terribly, tragically wrong. Neville Chamberlain was forced to resign as Prime Minister. The British government was in chaos, and the only man acceptable to all political parties was the very man they had mocked for a decade. At the age of 65, Winston Churchill finally became Prime Minister. He later wrote that as he went to bed that first night, he felt as if he were walking with destiny, and that all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour. But the reality he inherited was a nightmare. Within days, the French army collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force was cornered at Dunkirk. Behind closed doors in the War Cabinet, an intense and secret battle took place. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, argued that Britain had lost and must negotiate a peace treaty with Hitler through Mussolini. The pressure to surrender was overwhelming. It was the logical, rational thing to do. But Churchill despised logic when it meant bowing to tyranny. He argued passionately, violently against negotiations. He told his cabinet that if the long history of their island story was to end at last, let it end only when each of them lay choking in their own blood upon the ground. He won the argument. Britain would fight on, completely alone. It was during these desperate months that Churchill deployed his greatest weapon, not the army, not the navy, but the English language. When he spoke to the nation over the radio, he didn't offer false hope. He offered blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He told the British people the absolute truth about the terror that was coming, but he infused that truth with a defiant courage that was utterly contagious. When the rescue at Dunkirk succeeded against all odds, he warned that wars are not won by evacuations, and delivered perhaps the most famous speech in human history. He declared that they would fight on the beaches, they would fight on the landing grounds, in the fields, in the streets, and in the hills. They would never surrender. When the Battle of Britain began, and the German Luftwaffe rained fire down upon London and cities across the country during the Blitz, Churchill did not hide in an underground bunker. While the bombs fell, he would put on his velvet siren suit, grab his walking stick, and climb to the rooftops of London to watch the destruction with a defiant scowl. He visited the bombed-out streets the very next morning, tears streaming down his face as people pulled bodies from the rubble. The citizens of London didn't ask him for peace. They shouted at him to give it back to the Germans. Churchill became the living embodiment of the British bulldog. With his trademark cigar clamped in his jaw, his fingers raised in the V for victory sign, and his bowler hat perched on his head, he became an icon. But behind the iconic image was a highly eccentric and exhausting human being. Churchill's daily routine was legendary and chaotic. He hated the mornings. He would wake up at 7, but stay in bed until noon, eating a massive breakfast, reading the newspapers, and dictating memos to his terrified secretaries while still wearing his silk pajamas. He took a long, absolute nap every single afternoon, a habit he picked up in Cuba, claiming it allowed him to squeeze a day and a half out of every 24 hours. He fueled his relentless energy with a steady stream of Pol Roger champagne, weak scotch and sodas, and endless Cuban cigars. He often conducted meetings from his bathtub. He was a tyrant to his staff, prone to explosive outbursts of temper, but he was also quick to tears, deeply emotional, and fiercely loyal. Churchill knew that Britain could not defeat Nazi Germany alone. His ultimate strategy, his absolute obsession, was to drag the United States into the war. He heavily courted President Franklin D. Roosevelt, writing him thousands of letters and telegrams. He crossed the treacherous U-boat-infested Atlantic Ocean multiple times just to meet with Roosevelt face to face. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the conflict, Churchill famously slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. He knew, in that exact moment, that the war was ultimately won, even if the road ahead was soaked in blood. As the war progressed, Churchill formed the Big Three with Roosevelt and the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. It was an uneasy, unnatural alliance. Churchill was a staunch anti-communist, but he famously remarked that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. He sat at the tables of power in Tehran and Yalta, carving up the post-war world, fighting desperately to preserve the British Empire while navigating the immense, overwhelming power of the United States and the Soviet Union. When victory in Europe finally arrived in May 1945, the crowds gathered in London cheering his name. He stood on the balcony of Whitehall, the savior of the nation. Yet, just 2 months later, the British public voted him out of office in a massive landslide. The people wanted a new, modern Britain, a welfare state, and they did not see the great warlord as the man to build a peaceful future. The shock of the defeat was profound, but Churchill accepted it with grace. He was far from finished. He warned the world once again, this time about the Soviet threat, coining the phrase, the Iron Curtain. and defining the political reality of the Cold War. Against all expectations, he returned as Prime Minister in his late 70s, an old lion roaring one last time before his health finally forced him to retire. When Winston Churchill died in 1965 at the age of 90, the entire world stopped to mourn. A state funeral, the likes of which had not been seen for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington, brought kings, queens, and presidents to London. The cranes along the River Thames dipped their jibs in respect as his coffin sailed past. Winston Churchill was not a perfect man. He held imperialist views that belonged to the past. He made catastrophic military blunders, and his abrasive personality made him a difficult ally. But history is rarely shaped by flawless people. History is shaped by those who, in the absolute darkest of times, find a light within themselves. In 1940, when liberty was seemingly entirely lost, it was Churchill's voice, his stubbornness, and his raw, unfiltered courage that bought the free world the time it needed to survive. He was the man who stood alone, so that the rest of the world wouldn't have to. If you found this journey into history fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story of the famous and mysterious figures who shaped our world. Leave a comment below telling us which historical mystery or legendary figure you want us to explore next. Until then, keep looking back, because the past holds the keys to everything.